Hope everybody's having a great week. Thank you for joining us for our September webinar. We're doing these next three webinars are going to be a little different than we've done in the past. They're sort of a series all around the topic of making faster progress in your OT security program. So why are we doing this? As I think many of you may know who have joined us on these in the past, Verve has been doing OT reliability and security for over 30 years, and particularly security for the past 15 or so. And in that time, what we find is that a lot of organizations have really struggled with getting these things off the ground and then maintaining it over time. There's a lot of barriers to getting OT security working right. We're going to talk a little bit about those today. But anyway, this seems to be a common theme as we meet new organizations. Many of them have tried something, or alternatively, individuals in that organization have tried something. And then over time, it gets stuck. And that may get stuck at the beginning. It may get stuck partway through. It may be that, hey, we've made good progress, but, maintaining this is very, very difficult, and it sort of fades off. In a way, this is OT security has this great benefit of being in the world of ops, right? We're so used to, in operations, running a process, building continuous improvement, running ops kind of programs. Oftentimes that's done a bit in a silo, right? It's done in our world of production, let's say. And security obviously isn't just production, right? There's a variety of parts of the organization involved. But many of those operational mindsets can really help us as we think about how do we execute a program. Whether, frankly, you're executing a quality program or a security program, many of those principles still align. So anyway, we're going to go through these three webinars over 3 months. Today's is focused on kind of the beginning, or at least early in the journey. How do you get it unstuck? And we'll talk more what we mean by unstuck. The next couple of webinars are going to be around, the next one's going to be around how do you then build a business case and a program to essentially lay out what is going to be your journey to get a consistent program. And then the last one will be more about maintaining it and really making a difference in terms of the security. But today's is focused around how do we get unstuck? And so often we see that organizations have, as I mentioned, have gotten started or tried to get started. And there's just this inertia that's really tough to break through. It's almost like people are running in mud. And there's a variety of reasons for that. There's a variety of different kind of case studies or better phrased scenarios of where this happens. And so today we're going to talk about some of those, and we're going to talk about some of the things we've seen be helpful in getting unstuck. And most of this, all of this, frankly, is based on kind of seeing the movie for the last 15 years and helping clients get unstuck. And so it's going to be a bit personal. It's going to be kind of stories and examples, but hopefully those examples, there's a framework that we use, but hopefully those examples are helpful to you to the extent that you're struggling with kind of getting momentum and getting liftoff, I'll call it, in your OT security program. So without further ado, sorry for the long intro, but I think it's helpful as we go through these next few. For those of you who have not joined us in the past, just by way of introduction, I'm John Livingston. If you have joined us in the past, you're probably sick of my voice. My apologies for that. We're trying to just be as helpful as we can getting the message out there about how to make this work effectively. I'm the CEO of Verve. I've been here for about 7 years. Prior to that, I spent 20 years of my career at McKinsey & Company, where I was a senior partner there, doing a lot of these change management, big change program type things. And OT security is one of those. It's probably one of the more challenging ones of those that I've been a part of in the last 27 years. What is Verve, or who is Verve? So as I mentioned, Verve has been in the business for 30 years. We were founded as a controls programming company. So essentially helping do systems integration on control systems. And so we come out of a world of OT, or frankly, better phrased, industrial control systems. And so have a empathy, I guess I'll call it, for people on the front line trying to make product or make power or whatever it happens to be. About 15 years ago, we built a software platform called the Verve Security Center, which really was the beginning of our step into the security side of things. And today, 95% of what we do is security related, using our software platform, but also providing a range of services. And we'll talk more about that as kind of our feeling, at least, of the need here around expert services and expert help in this journey. So anyway, that's a bit about us, but we probably won't talk that much about Verve until very much at the end here. So what are we going to talk about? First of all, OT security has obviously become a very hot topic. Literally in the last couple of weeks with Clorox and others, it continuously pops to the top of the screen. I was talking with a big IT SOC provider yesterday, and they were commenting on how many requests they're getting now from their clients to build real IT OT SOCs and integration. But it's often kind of a hot potato. Who owns this thing? And there's a bit of this two-way of, well, I own it. Well, but I don't really want to own it. And so there's this sort of hot potato notion to it. It is not easy, and it is not IT. One of the things we're going to talk about a lot in here is, the IT approach to this and kind of, we got this. It's not easy, and it is not IT. We'll talk about that. Number 3, leads to a number of problems, right? Getting funded in the first place, then getting started, then making progress in actually reducing the risks. Each has a slightly different challenge in it, and we're going to talk about that, about how do you possibly break through some of those challenges. And lastly, we've seen a lot of folks try this, struggling. We think we've got an approach of how to get unstuck with some kind of tricks of the trade, so to speak, that hopefully will help you in the journeys that you're in. So to start with, for those of you who have been with us before, you may have seen this chart. We like to come back to it because it really, in our view, starts to tell the story of why this is such a challenge. We really are under an air raid, and it's not just the attackers, which is obviously number 1 on this list, but we have met the enemy and the enemy is us kind of thing. There's a lot of these things down here that are not just about the enemy or the attackers, but they're about our organizations and how we deal with that. So obviously ICS is becoming a bigger target. IT is now getting more and more involved, and this is only increasing every year when you look at the surveys. Both the CISO is becoming more responsible for the area of OT security, but also IT is moving more and more and more into the OT world, which is wonderful in many ways, but it does create complexity, both because it starts to open up new pathways for attackers, but also because you get differing points of view about how to manage systems. Regulatory pressures are increasing around the world. The resource constraints aren't getting any less. The number of vulnerabilities is only exploding more and more. Right, to be honest, we just don't have enough people to do the jobs of running these plants in many cases, not to mention now we're adding all these new tasks. Increasing access for AI now and big data and all the rest of that. Insurance is a big deal of late. We're seeing, significantly more inquiries around how do I deal with my insurance companies who are asking a bunch of questions around OT, essentially effectively asking us to be doing in OT what we do in IT. And that creates, again, a whole different group of people in a large organization who are now involved in this discussion. Risk officers, legal officers, CFOs, et cetera. And then finally, obviously, boards of directors. This has now become a hot topic. So, like I said, it's attackers, certainly, but there's a lot of things we're doing internally in large organizations that are only adding to the air raid that's happening. I mentioned insurance. We've got a whole webinar, particularly on that from maybe 18 months ago. But I think the important point here is, as we think about how we get stuck in things, right, there seems to be a lot of momentum. Hey, do something, because now we have an OT cyber policy supplemental application we have to fill in. And so now the chief risk officers are calling and saying, hey, what are we doing? And that's great. It now gets focus. By the same token, it creates new people involved in what we should be doing. More voices, which is, again, not a bad thing if that integration is managed well. But this insurance thing becomes a really, really, really big deal. And we did this webinar 18 months ago. This is probably 3 or 4 times as important, or maybe phrased as in terms of the interest and the questions that we're getting today than it was 18 months ago. The great news is that there are recommendations out there that we can follow. And so as we think about building programs, it's not like we can't build a roadmap, right? It's out there. Unfortunately, there's probably way too many frameworks, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And that can confuse people. And every time, somebody comes out with a new vulnerability or whatever, and CISA then makes a set of recommendations, it looks like, oh, geez, a whole nother one. In fact, they are very, very, very consistent over time, right? The expert recommendations about the components of what we should be doing here are very, very consistent. And they're these 8 things. Now there's a devil in the details of each of these, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about today and how we get stuck in them. But the point here is, this is the basic strategy of what we want to do, is not the hard part. We don't have to go try and, oh, geez, what are the things we should do? Well, there's 8 things. How we go about executing on that, getting buy-in, getting priority, and actually making this stuff happen, that's where we tend to get stuck. I mentioned the stakeholders. I don't know how many of you are doing this today, but what we see often is you have a huge range of stakeholders in OT security, actually way more than in IT security. And those stakeholders have oftentimes not really worked together. Obviously, the board and the CEO are working together all the time, right? But now we've got, a CISO working with the SVP of Ops, for instance, or the CIO working with the SVP of Ops, and plant managers. And in many cases, IT has been left out of OT. And we won't go through the whole IT-OT divide and all of that. There's been lots written about that. But the point is that there are a lot of people who often get involved in this decision that haven't necessarily interacted a lot before in the business context of, okay, well, those switches that are sitting behind a firewall that are the static switches in the plant, the CIO may have no idea they exist. And they've been run by plant managers or by somebody in the ops group for years. And now they are a security risk. So who's going to manage them? How do we think about it? Who's accountable? A bunch of questions come up, and each person probably has a bit of their own goals. The plant managers, hey, I got to make product. The SVP of Ops, I got to keep my systems running, and I got a P&L to hit on my manufacturing margins, for instance. That may be a different objective than the CISO in his day job. And so anyway, a lot of different perspectives, I guess I'll call it. And so the poor person who is deemed the OT cyber leader, and by the way, that's potentially a misplaced title, right, is now got a bunch of different pressures on them. hey, don't screw production up. That is the most important thing. We got to produce. Right. I got that. But find a way to do this whole security thing. You're not going to get any more budget. And then, the random questions come up of, hey, we got this particular vulnerability. How many servers do I have with that? Or how many Rockwell PLCs with the following firmware version do I have with that? And just, you got to make progress. And the question becomes, well, what standard do you want me to make progress on? IEC 62443. Well, no, we're using CIS, or we're using, NIST. Pick your favorite, right? So this job of this poor quote unquote OT cyber leader, and maybe some of you are it, can really feel like a no-win proposition. And oftentimes they don't feel like leaders. They're really feeling like shepherds trying to herd sheep, because the amount of decision-making authority they have is very, very minimal. I also mentioned, this is not IT. I think, and we're going to talk about this, but one of the biggest problems we find is, on one hand or the other, this gets assigned, right? So the CISO, who's come out of IT, says, well, this is the way we do things. And, I have to scan it, because that's how I find vulnerabilities. I'm going to centralize the patching. I've got my teams, right? I've got if I'm the CIO, I've got a team that's doing patching, another team that's doing vulnerabilities, another one's running the SOC if I'm the CISO. And so each of those silos is going to go at this problem like we did in IT. And frankly, if I need to find out what a device is, I'm going to scan it. And I don't really need a lot of help in this. I'm just going to go execute my strategies. And obviously in OT, that's a very different set of objectives. Around uptime, there's been no history of ITSM. We like to call this, the asbestos in the attic. You go back in these plants and you find these devices that are 40 years old that have literally thousands of vulnerabilities on them. And you're thinking, okay, how am I going to replace that asbestos? Well, as we all know, if we got to take asbestos out, there's a whole process that, in this case, the same, right? We probably have to upgrade the control system. So anyway, a variety of challenges between IT and OT, and doing OT security is not doing IT security. It's not as easy. It's not as simple. Easy is the wrong term, because IT security isn't easy. It's not as straightforward, maybe the best way of putting that. Anyway, and then we've got the big challenge here, which is resourcing. Not to say that I don't want to claim in any way that IT security has, tons of resources. We totally understand that. They are constrained absolutely as well. But when you flip this into ICS or OT, the biggest problem is insufficient personnel. And this is 2019 survey. The 2021 survey said the same thing. The 2023 survey said it says the same thing every year. Insufficient personnel, insufficient expertise, is because we just haven't done it before. And so if we're going to solve the problem, we got to solve it there. Okay. So what are some of our challenges, right? What are some of the things that we see, the common challenges that lead to these false starts? So first is knowing where to begin. So I have those 8 things from CISA, for instance. I've got 50 plants around the world, or locations, or, I've got different business units, maybe even. I've got, if I'm a power company, I've got generation, I've got distribution and transmission, what have you. Where do I begin? And that is oftentimes a big debate among all those different stakeholders. And so you get stuck. Sometimes, there's the jump in. Look, we'll figure it out. Just go do segmentation. And people jump in with segmentation. We're going to talk about this as an example. And all of a sudden you get this false start, because the segmentation hasn't really been thought of what we need to get that effectively done, who's bought in, et cetera. Not considering resource requirements. So you get part of the way in, we've seen organizations, they go do some great work and start to, harden their systems. Let's say they're putting in software, they're, they do segmentation, but no one's thought about, the maintaining of that. And so you very quickly get stuck because you do the first 2 or 3 plants and people say, oh, okay, well, my SEMS just went down. Who's going to deal with that? Somebody made a network change because you did segmentation. Well, who's going to deal with SEMS? And if you don't solve that quick, the next 3 or 4 plants are going to balk and say, well, look, we're going to shut down production if you do this thing. Not considering the maintenance, sort of same point there. IT OT coordination. We talked a little bit about this, but a lot of times we just never get started because OT says you can't come into my plant right now because that's downtime and that's money. And so until we solve that, we're often stuck. And then finally getting distracted. What seems like progress can often be being stuck. Meaning, hey, we got to go find this latest vulnerability that some vendor published. Sometimes, often, some of the cybersecurity vendors go out with these big notices, and it's great. We have to get more known vulnerabilities, but oftentimes it distracts us from the foundational elements that still need to be put in place. Anyway, variety of things that get stuck. And so some of the biggest pitfalls that we're seeing is, the first one is IT's got this. Hey, I know what to do. I'm the CISO. I'm the CIO. Been there, done that. Been successful. So I know how to do this. Just give me the reins, and I'm going to tell everybody this is how we do these things. Number 2, this is plant security. This is just like running, any other kind of thing that might disrupt operations in the plant. And so the plant needs to run it. Right? We've given authority to that plant manager for P&L. They got to be in charge. Well, that can create some significant problems in places where you need to have more centralized scale and consistency. Another one we see a lot. First step is get an asset inventory of every asset, every vulnerability, and then we'll figure out how to build a plan. And this always bogs down because, as all of you who have been in OT know, getting that complete 100% asset inventory is not easy. It's not IT. And so this oftentimes, you hit a wall and you just never get to actually securing anything. On the other hand, we hear oftentimes, okay, we're just going to go segment. Before we do anything, segment the plants. That's our first step. And as people get into that, they get stuck because they realize, well, to segment, I actually have to know all of what I've got, or at least I need to know a lot of what I got. I need to know what it's connected to, because if I start to segment stuff and separate it, and I don't know the assets, I can bring down production. And so the first get into that, the IT team goes in and tries to segment, and either the plant says, you don't understand this, or alternatively, you try and you shut down operations, and then it all gets futzed up and stopped. Reacting or changing the latest marketed vulnerabilities I mentioned. And then, another one we see a lot is, okay, we're going to do kind of a big mega galactic assessment across all of our sites, pen tests, and survey based. We're going to send surveys out to the plants. We're going to go visit all the plants. And what happens is this just gets bogged down in its own weight. And you're 18 to 24 months in, and you're still trying to figure out what's the assessment. So how do we get unstuck at a principles basis? We're then going to dive into some details, but what are some of the principles we've seen? Well, the first is accept where you are and make progress quickly. By needing the whole full plan, which, by the way, we're not arguing you don't need. Eventually you need it. But by showing traction, by showing you can make a difference, a lot of this gunk in the work starts to get freed up because people say, oh, okay, somebody's making traction. Somebody's making progress in things. Number 2, focus on prioritized risk reduction rather than tasks and check marks. As you get into this, if you're part of the way through the journey, you know this. If you're not, as you get into it, you will find that there are literally thousands, tens of thousands of vulnerabilities, for instance, in your environment, because you haven't done anything with it typically in 10 years. if you're trying to get to a point where you're going to do all of those risks and try and solve all of it, it's just not going to work. So prioritize the risk reduction and try and get to things that you can drive, move things from red to green, so to speak, right? From a red risk to green, rather than just saying, okay, check the box. I, segmented that plant, check. Did I do asset inventory everywhere? Check. No, you have to go after prioritizing the risks because you're just not going to get it all done in time if you don't. Number 3, creating a true IT OT team at the top and on the project teams. Inevitably, the teams that we've seen be successful in this have an OT person as the spearhead. There has to be somebody relatively senior in OT who buys in, who then becomes the spearhead of this. If it's driven by IT without that being done, we haven't seen it ever work. You really need those pieces to come together. Number 4, conducting tech-enabled assessments. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. If you've seen some of our other webinars, you've seen that. Whatever technology you use, we would strongly recommend not doing the survey-based visit every site, trying to get the data from the people at the plants. They don't know the data, and they don't have the time to gather it for you. And so by using technology, you can get a pretty quick read on where your vulnerabilities are, and you can, or risks, I shouldn't just say vulnerability, risks are, and you can start to put together plans in a much more rapid fashion. Number 4, consider resourcing early rather than later. We had a client who was really a great leader and basically said, look, before I'm doing anything on remediating anything, we need a resource plan. We need to know how many hours this is going to take. We need to know how many people this is going to take. Because if I get halfway in this journey and I haven't thought about that, I really haven't thought about the program and it will get stopped. If you're the CISO, get out and visit your plants, your sites. The number of times we go in and the CISO has not spent deep time at the manufacturing, production, whatever facilities is huge, right? Because they're busy people. No criticism, busy people. But unless you've gone out and spent real time with I&C techs and plant managers and understand their problems and gone and walked down those facilities and seen these assets and how they're connected or not, and what the fiber situation is like at these plants, you will make assumptions of what you can do that may not be realistic. Don't let perfect be the enemy of progress. There's a lot of things we can get done. And yeah, okay, you may say, well, I can't replace all these Windows 7 devices. Okay, but there's a lot of things you might be able to do that will significantly reduce your risk. Find others that have been down the road and listen and learn from their mistakes and the things they've learned. And I don't just mean, consultants like us, but I mean other companies. Build a CISO or OT network of other people in your general space to talk to. How have they done it? What are they struggling with? There's a lot to be learned after having gone through the journey. And then finally, recognize that in production, if you touch it, you own it. One of the things we see regularly is a SecureOT team will go in and do, I'll just use segmentation, but it could be a variety of things, right? And they do the segmentation. And to be honest, it's fine. They did it right. The network devices that they've put in work fine. The segmentation rules are working, et cetera. But for some reason, one of the systems stops working. And what happens? Everybody points to the last guy that touched the system and says, you broke it. And in many cases, we see the response to that being, no, we didn't. Ours is working fine. And it's left at that. And recognize, let's assume for a second, it wasn't your fault. Let's assume it has some other reason, right? A device stopped working, whatever. That mindset immediately creates friction. And, our clients, our OT folks always say, right? If you touched it, you own it. You help figure it out, even if it's not your fault. Because that builds trust and faith in you as a partner to that production environment, not as a, hey, we're checking a box, we did our thing, that's on you. That you've come as a team to solve the problem, and recognizing, hey, somebody else is going to have to fix it. It wasn't our, we didn't actually, we can't change our firewall, for instance, to make that work, but you're there as part of the team trying to fix it. Anyway, I'll pause it. There are probably others of these principles, and if you talk to a dozen of our clients who have gone through the journey, they would give you, other ones of these, which is why I think the, finding others that have been through the journey is really helpful. So here's what we're going to do for the next 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes. I'm going to talk through some case studies. Don't know if these are exactly where you all may be in your journey, but these are things we've seen, and they hopefully will give some perspective of how do you get unstuck in these different steps that you may be stuck in. The first one's going to be around network segmentation, right? You started all good things. You started a network segmentation, and for whatever reason, it stalled. It's not moving forward. You can't get buy-in. You've done one site, two sites, or maybe you've done some level of segmentation, but it's really not protecting much. So it gets stalled. Number two is, we're in like month 18 of trying to do site level assessments, and we still aren't much closer to having a real roadmap. Number three, we began a year ago or 18 months ago saying we need an inventory, or alternatively, 3 years ago, we did an inventory, but now it's out of date. And so we don't really know what we need to protect. How do we ever make progress if we don't know what we need to protect? Number four, the budget problem. How are we ever going to get budget to do the things we want to do in a world of, declining budgets and all the rest? And then finally, and as a vendor, we see this a lot. But hey, we've done an RFI, we've done an RFP. Nobody meets the requirements. So now we're stuck, and we're trying to figure out how do we move forward when we built this wonderful RFP of all the things we need to do in OT security, and nobody met it. And so we're now in, month 18 of trying to get that RFP closed out and select a partner, and maybe we're not going to do it, and et cetera. So anyway, these are 5 case studies. By the way, there'd be we could do 20 of these, but hopefully this gives some flavor of the kinds of things you can do to get unstuck. So starting with the network segmentation. So very real situation. IT began a segmentation effort. By the way, the right answer, it was clearly one of the biggest risks for this organization, risk remediation opportunities for this organization. A couple of reasons why these things can stall out. And sometimes they're all operating at the same way together. So, plant didn't buy into the design. So, hey, this is what we think the design should be, but the plant wouldn't buy it. We needed to adjust the way the OEM systems were architected a little bit. Nope, can't do that. Hardware and OT, we had a wonderful design, and then we met the enemy, and the enemy was, all of those 25-year-old switches in the OT environment that wouldn't do what we wanted them to do. Initial segmentation, actually broke stuff, right? Or at least appeared to break stuff. So anyway, it's stuck, and you get into this debate of whose fault it was and why it's not working, et cetera. So what have we found that can work there? How do you resolve this situation? So number one is on that team, adding OT cross OEM vendor networking people. What we find in most organizations is these people exist. Sometimes there's a whole organization structure focused on this, depending on the size of the company, right? There may be a whole team of people who are doing, sometimes it's called plant IT, sometimes it's called process control management. Don't know exactly what it is, but there may be a team. In other cases, there's no team, but there are individuals that actually understand the control systems in these plants and have some networking knowledge. Find them and bring them on the team and get them to help do the design and, frankly, the communication of what you're going to do. Perfect example of this. We had a client who had spent probably 18 months trying to segment their OT stuff. They had broken some stuff. They had, shut down production sometimes because they had, now not long, right, but for periods of time. And they'd been doing it pretty much in a silo, and some ways a conflict with a team of folks who were doing kind of plant to IT. And once they broke that silo and they basically said, okay, look, we just want a solution, quote unquote, plant IT. And that wasn't what their group was called. You guys tell us what is the best architecture for us to do what we want to do. And they came in and described it. And here's what I think we want to do. And here's what can be done and what can't be done. And here's, by the way, how we need, what level of detail and rigor we need in the planning of doing this. Once that was flipped, all of a sudden progress started to be made. And it sounds slower at the beginning because you're now bringing in different people, and they may tell you, we need more pre-work done before we execute. But the go slow to go fast absolutely can, is effective. Number two is visit and walk down the sites and listen to those challenges. So back to the point of, if the CISO and his team has not been out to, half of your plant, maybe not half, but a very large portion of your facilities, it depends a bit on how your manufacturing or production or whatever it is structured. But unless they're out walking down stuff and seeing the challenges, you're probably not going to get past this. So that's number two. Number three is plan. So as I mentioned in that example, every OT change needs to understand all of the potential operational issues. And if something happens, how you're going to roll it back. We've done some work. We've done a webinar on network segmentation probably 7 months ago. If you want to understand what that's about, you can watch that. But basically, make sure it's planned. Number four, start with a deep understanding of the assets and how they connect to one another. One of our clients calls this the no asset left behind, NALB. And love that term, right? Is when we do the segmentation, we're not going to leave some asset out there that we didn't know about. Now, I said before, don't let the asset inventory get you, so stuck that you can't do anything. These things are not, they may sound that they're conflict, they're not. Our point here is that, yes, are you going to know every single asset, every vulnerability, every firmware version, et cetera, et cetera? Probably not. But what you can know is, where are those critical assets and where are they connecting to, right? So going into those switches and understanding what are the rules in the switches, what's connecting through that switch to what are the flows, basically. It's critical, because that's how you make sure you don't break stuff. And then lastly, the point I made earlier around designing with those OT personnel. So again, there are ways around this problem, but it requires teamwork. It requires patience. It requires thinking differently than you might had if you've been doing segmentation in the IT side of the house. All right, second one, budget buy-in problems. This is something that my guess is many of you are dealing with, right? Hey, we've never spent any money on OT-specific cyber. Frankly, we may have never spent any money at all on, other than, when we do a control system upgrade, on really maintaining those systems, right? So yeah, we upgrade our Rockwell PLCs when we do a control systems upgrade. But there is a need per the air raid point. But we don't have any compliance requirements. So there's no we're not going to get fined if we don't do something. Well, maybe there's something that says if we haven't reported an incident, like in a NIS2 sort of thing. But it's hard to justify it like I have to prove something every month to a regular, every quarter to a regulator. And then whose budget is it? Right. So CISO has a budget, but those switches and those firewalls and if we got to hire our partner, who's our control system engineering firm, to come in and update firmware, whose budget is that? That's historically been the plant budget. So there's this unclear budget. Okay, so how do we do this? Again, no badge, no silver bullet here, but these are the kinds of things that can start to get you unstuck. So first is awareness workshops. And this does not mean, fear mongering. It does not mean, coming in and saying, oh, well, there's all these fancy named attack groups who are going to attack us. It's basic awareness of here's some of the risks that we have in our environment. Like, let's just look at as simple as Bluekeep and WannaCry, right? My guess is in many environments, you've got those vulnerabilities on the systems. They haven't been patched. They haven't been updated. There's some relatively basic things, right? Hey, our passwords haven't been changed in 18 months. Raising the basic awareness of there's a problem here and we probably need to do something, but also the awareness of the education around from the OT side, explaining to IT, what are the issues that we see. One of my favorites is we did one of these awareness workshops with one of our clients, and we were describing the different ways of doing vulnerability analysis, and we talked about scanning, which is risky in OT, and the OT folks in the plants spoke up to the IT people and said, you do realize that every time you do one of those, we probably lose half a dozen to a dozen PLCs. And it stops production for a period of time until we get those back online. No one knew. No one had an idea that that was happening because someone was scanning from, corporate, and, the folks in the plant, they were like, I'll just deal with it again. Translating OT into IT security concepts. There are many things we want to do in OT, in IT security, which may not work exactly the same in IT. Or in OT, sorry. So we need to translate those things so that people can understand what we're talking about in the budget. Back to the tech-enabled assessment, we think it is a great way to really build a practical remediation plan that you can then put a budget to. And it doesn't take you, 3 years to do that. It takes you, half the time or less than you would if you were going to try and do a physical or a, survey-based type of one. Targeted low-cost approaches to start making progress. Many people want to go in and sort of sell the big mega galactic budget. Almost never works. So targeting specific things that we can go get done in year one. So one of our clients really thought was a very brilliant thing. He basically said, he was a CISO, and said, we are going to bite off X number of our largest plants. They are worth X in total production value. And a segmentation of those plants is going to cost us Y. And we're going to get that done within the next 9 months or whatever it was. And I think in the first place, he said, we're going to do 7 of them in 3 months or something. And he bought off a bite of the apple. He then went back to the board and said, okay, we did that. And now here's the next piece we want. And as they went, they were able to gain more and more respect from their board, from their CFO, from their CEO, of they were making progress and demonstrating impact. And that budget over time increased to what the need was. But it was a very methodical way of demonstrating success. And then finally, number 5, what you may have heard us talk about before, OTSM, OT systems management. The investment returns from cyber go beyond cyber. And in many times, we find things as we're putting in cyber solutions or as we're doing remediations, we find operational problems that have been driving them nuts for years, but nobody quite understood it because there's not networking people at that plant, for instance. And we can actually improve production times, uptimes, through the work that we're doing in cyber. And so thinking about the ROI, not just in terms of security, but in terms of reliability and uptime. And frankly, lower labor cost of chasing problems because you now have visibility where you didn't before. So a variety of things that we can do to start to resolve the budget. And we're going to do kind of a fuller deep dive in our next webinar around, how do you build that business case? The asset inventory challenges. We hear this and see this a lot as we talk to new organizations. So, they've started to deploy a network tap or span to try to see assets. And they've been monitoring it for several months, and they're at 50%, 60% of what they think their assets are. Or they've done part of the deployment, but they've realized as they've gotten deeper into it, oh, wow, if I really want to get visibility everywhere, that's a lot of spans and taps and a lot of fiber and whatever. Or alternatively, it's not spans and tabs. It's just, hey, our plan is we're going to get 100% asset visibility. We're going to know everything about every asset before we go and start looking at the broader risks and what we might be able to do about them. And so you get stuck, all right, at that 70, 80%, not because of a technology problem or a fault of anyone. It's people in the plants are busy, right? And to connect to some of these devices requires changes. It requires credentials to really get at what those devices are. It takes time. But that's time you're losing in making progress on risk reduction. So what do we do? So first thing is we would recommend you thinking about an endpoint approach rather than relying on the spans and taps. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one here. You've probably all heard us talk about that in the past. If you haven't, there's probably a dozen webinars on that. We have a very different approach and a different belief of the best way to get your asset inventory. The second is focus on risk remediation rather than 100%. So what I mean by this is, as the CISO or as the team leader, going and getting a view of a few sites or whatever it is, and sharing that integrated risk view with the senior management team, showing them, hey, look, we don't have 100% of our assets covered already. Maybe we got 70, 60, whatever it is. But you know what we do have? We have a clear view of, at those 3 or 4 sites, here is the critical assets, and here's where the risks are. And oh, by the way, these first 60, 70% of your assets are like 95% of your risk. And those vulnerabilities and risks on those are going to take us a year to fix or more. And so, yes, we should finish off the rest of the asset inventory. We're never saying don't have a complete view. By the same token, there are so many risks in these environments. By getting that initial view, you can start to make real progress on reducing your risk while you finish up the rest of that asset inventory work that will take time, right? Even with the best of technology, these, as you all know, probably these networks are very complicated with needing credentials, et cetera. So anyway, and then lastly, move to make progress and come back. So kind of that same point, right? So focus on risk remediation, focus on making progress in risk reduction rather than just a checkbox, checklist mindset of, well, I do asset inventory before I do anything else. We sell an asset inventory platform. It is critical. We're not arguing it's not, but it's not the end result. It's the contributor to the end result, which is how do I reduce risk in the environment? And so getting that message across. The stalled site assessments. So real world example, decided the need to do this. Basically got wind back from the consulting firms that this was going to be 18 or more likely 36 months. It was going to be literally, $6, $7, $8 million to get this done because of all the labor and the traveling, et cetera. And, it gets stuck, not surprisingly, right? It's, wow, that's expensive. That's going to take forever. And so you just get bogged down in all the usual challenges of budgets and priorities, et cetera. So for this, you can do these things in less than half the time, right? So as an example, we did 60 manufacturing facilities in around the world, literally geographies all over the place, did all the assessments, all the roadmaps, et cetera, within 8 months, something like that, at a fraction of what it would cost if you had to actually put people on the street and put them on airplanes and try and do surveys and all the rest of that. And more importantly, by doing that, you're not relying on whatever somebody at the plant puts into a survey, which in most cases, they're not probably going to understand the data that you need them to give you. The other thing is, don't start with everything, right? You can do this on 3, 4, 5 sample sites, and you can get a really good view of what that roadmap is going to look like. And yes, no question, as you get to the next site and the next site and the next site, it'll be a little different. Certainly like, oh, well, how exactly I do that segmentation, for instance, will be a little different. The specific vulnerabilities may be a little different. But the general view of what your risks are, the general view that you need to go back to the prior page and start to get budget to make some progress, those first sites, those pilots, so to speak, that you would do in the assessments give you a ton of information. And so we strongly encourage people, don't necessarily jump to the mega galactic 36-month thing. Go spend 2 or 3, do 4 sites, 5 sites, get those done, build yourself a first view. And then certainly you want to roll that out and make sure you have a specific plan for every site. But again, this starts to get you unstuck. It starts to be able to allow you to make some progress. And then the failed or failing RFI. Like I said, we've been in a lot of these. You finally got some buy-in to invest, and that's great news. And you launch a comprehensive programmatic RFI. We were just in the middle of one that literally it was all singing, all dancing. We are going to protect everything. We're going to do everything. We're going to do vulnerability management. We're going to do patch management. We're going to do backups. We're going to do whitelisting. We're going to do AV. We're going to do segmentation. We're going to do policies and procedures. And I mean, it was everything from the start. And I think it's probably at least a year ongoing and hasn't been decided yet. And this isn't atypical, right? We then talk to clients after they've tried one of these, and oftentimes it's like, hey, how do we select? What are the priorities? What are the criteria? And it's really hard to tell the difference between this and that and the other thing. So I think the most important part of this is there is no silver bullet to OT security. I think some of our peers in the industry have done a disservice with, hey, if you just buy my tool, that's OT security. It's not. It's not. I won't tell you if you just buy Verve, it's OT security. It's not. It's a great part of the OT security program, but you need people, you need programs, and probably you need more than one piece of software. If you look in the IT side, right, there are dozens of different pieces of software that you would need to secure your environment. As one of our clients said, yeah, we have 7 towers, they called them, for cybersecurity. We have vulnerability management, we have patch management, we have configuration, 7 towers, and then we have OT, which is the 8th tower. Well, no, it's not another tower. It's another slice of all those towers. So anyway, there's no silver. Number 2, as in most IT efforts, targeted smaller efforts usually produce greater impact over time. So this is from my McKinsey days, right? I can't tell you how many of these sort of IT programs that we were involved with. And almost always it was after they got broken. And the reason they got broken was because they were trying to do this mega galactic thing and it was over budget, out of time, et cetera. Biting off pieces, recognizing there's a plan. I'm not arguing you don't want a plan. You absolutely want a plan. But then biting off pieces of things that you can start to make progress in that fit into that overall plan. And by the way, each one of those may be its own RFP. And that may be, you can debate whether that's the approach to use or not. But the point is going and getting wins on the board and not trying to build the mega galactic is a hugely beneficial way of getting unstuck in these. And then lastly, tools alone don't solve the challenge. You're going to need people. You're going to need tools and people to get there. And so if what you've done is said, great, I've done an RFP for, an inventory and vulnerability tool. Okay. Who's going to deploy it? Who's going to manage it once it's deployed? These are issues that are critical in thinking about how that RFP doesn't just turn into kind of a long-winded thing and people debating it. And then all of a sudden that issue gets raised of, well, have we thought about how we're going to get that deployed and managed? So these are 5 examples. And I think if you listen to what I'm saying in all of these, there's a lot of kind of common themes. And I think just to jump to the last page here, and I was hitting way too much content for this, back to the principles. Begin where you are and start to make some progress. All of those 5 examples have an element of that in there, focusing on risk reduction and prioritization rather than tasks. Creating that IT OT team, having an OT leader participating in this is absolutely key. Conducting tech-enabled assessments, it comes up a lot in here. It really, really saves time and gets you momentum. Don't let perfect be the enemy of progress. And then, in the production environment, it's different, which kind of ties into if you're the CISO, get out and visit. This is about trust. It's about understanding, et cetera. And a lot of these things can really help an organization get unstuck. So with that, I'll draw us to a close for this session. As I mentioned, there will be 2 more kind of continuing on from this. Okay, so if these are the things that get you unstuck, can you go deeper on a couple of these topics? I think there's one question. Security by culture would be the key to raise cyber awareness. Would be happy to hear your inputs on. Yes. So I think the kind of the question, Ravindra, is, is there a cultural element to getting buy-in or awareness? Absolutely, there is. Frankly, I think that oftentimes starts in the IT world, because in many organizations, IT security has kind of been at the forefront of this, and OT is kind of later. And creating that culture through, hey, your laptop and what you can click on and what you shouldn't click on. And, I know that's a very simple one. And then the question becomes, how do you create that same culture in a production environment, in an OT environment? And that is really hard. So as an example, we were trying to do this, and the client had, I can't remember the company, they had some software platform that they were using for their security awareness program. Well, it turns out that 75 or 80% of the people in the production environments don't have laptops. They don't have corporate laptops. They do not have access to the internet. They don't even have email addresses. So how do we train them? And how do we build awareness among that group? It's going to be a very different approach. It's going to be, unfortunately, much less efficient, because we don't have these technical tools that we can use. They don't have access. Again, I don't know what your organization is like, but we see it a lot. So then it becomes, how do we build it? So the example I always use is safety, right? If you go back 30 years, 35 years, safety wasn't kind of a common element of how we thought about production. But today it is. And we've been through this journey of awareness and tracking it and statistics and all the rest of that. And our view is that for cybersecurity to become a priority, we're going to need to treat it like safety. The same cultural mindsets that you have with safety programs. So hopefully that kind of addressed it. Anyway, we'll be doing, like I said, 2 more of these webinars continuing on from this. One about how to build a business case and get unstuck in the business case part, and then one how to make sure you actually make progress in remediating things and don't get stuck at just knowing the problem but not fixing them and maintaining it. Hope you all enjoyed the day today and the time this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And we appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much.